Hi friends, where is the best place to loot on Olympus in Apex Legends Season 8? I'm going to show you where all the best loot zones are on the map and explain why this should influence not just where you drop, but also where the best place to rotate is on Olympus in Apex Legends Season 8. I feel like this is the perfect time to do a video on the best places to loot on Olympus, because of course Olympus is the map for this ranked split, which means if you're grinding ranked, you'll probably want to think about some of the things I talk about in this video. Let's start by looking at the key points of interest on Olympus. I've gone over the map and I've marked what all of the different tiers of loot are in each area of Olympus. So this map shows you exactly where all the high tier loot is in purple, where all the mid tier loot is in blue, and where all the low tier areas are in grey. So you can use this map to think about where the best places to land are for loot. Obviously, you're more likely to find better loot in higher tier areas, but there also tends to be more squads that land in these kind of areas. This means you have a decision to make. Do you land in a high tier loot area and have to fight other teams early on? Or do you land in a low or mid tier area where there are fewer teams landing, but obviously your loot won't be quite as good, which might put you at a disadvantage later on in the game. Personally, I find it's better to land in a high or mid tier loot area. I find there's no real point landing in a low tier area because people that land in high tier and mid tier loot areas are going to have better loot than you, so you're instantly putting yourself at a disadvantage by limiting the level of loot that you'll have in the area of landing if you land in one of these grey areas. On top of this, you also don't want to land in a small area where there isn't much loot, especially if you're playing trios, even if it's a high tier loot area. So that's another thing to consider. For example, Research Basin. It's got high tier loot and you pretty much always guarantee a legendary and a bunch of purple items, but it's so small that if a whole team of trios land there, or even two teams, your chances of getting decent loot are very slim for your whole team, which means you will be in trouble if there are multiple teams landing in that area. Of course, as I said, because the high tier loot areas are more attractive, you'll likely have more squads there, so if you want an early fight, or you want a hot drop to try and pick up a bunch of early kills, it's actually not a bad idea to land in one of these high tier loot areas. I would still recommend picking an area that does have a lot of buildings though, or enough loot areas for your whole team, because like I said, you don't really want to be fighting over who gets the armor and weapons in your squad. If we look at the map again, interestingly, a lot of people do like to land at Bonsai Plaza and Gardens, which is interesting because it's only a mid-tier loot area. Although having said that, Bonsai Plaza does have a high-tier loot area in the middle. You know that part that connects the two buildings in Bonsai Plaza? That's actually a high-tier loot area. It's the same for Oasis. Basement in Oasis is actually a high-tier loot area. You always get really good stuff down there. So again, it's just another thing to consider. If you're landing in a mid-tier loot area, perhaps you want to go to the high-tier loot part of that area before looting the rest of the mid-tier area. In terms of where me and the Soggy Squad like to land, we actually have a couple of landing points that we like, and I would recommend doing the same. Try to pick 3 or 4 areas that you've practiced landing in a lot and you know exactly where you want to go when you land there. For us, it's Rift, Carrier, Orbital and Elysium. As you can tell, these are all high tier loot areas, so generally we get good enough loot to fight all the way through to the later rounds without having to worry too much about loot. It's also spread out enough that the whole Soggy Squad are able to each get decent loot, so we're not fighting over the same loot normally. And the other good thing we've done is that it's spread out across the map. So we've got an area in each corner of the map that we like to go to, and we've practiced landing in a lot of times, which means no matter what the drop path of the dropship is, there's at least 1 or 2 favourite areas that we can go to. So that's a bit about how you can use this loot map to decide where to land. But you can also use it to decide where to rotate to. If you've landed in a high or mid tier loot area, I would say it's normally a good idea to rotate through lower tier areas, shown by these grey boxes. The reason for this is because you're more likely to have a team that's got worse loot than you, so you can take advantage of that and potentially pick up some easy kills. Obviously this applies earlier on in the game. As the ring gets smaller, people tend to stack up, and generally by the end everyone's got fairly decent loot, so you want to take advantage of this early on if you can. It's also one of the reasons Orbital is a decent place to land, especially if the dropship follows the path over Orbital. As you can see, Orbital's surrounded by grey areas, so if you can land in Orbital and pick up some good high quality, high tier loot, you can push these grey areas quite quickly. Like I said, it depends on the path of the dropship, because people may not always land in these other grey areas, but if you can hot drop into Orbital, there's probably a good chance you can pick up some early kills there. I should say, where you land or rotate to does depend on what you're hoping to achieve. If you're hoping to land in a place like Skulltown used to be, Estates is a pretty good shout for that. People always seem to land there, and you can always get really good early fights with multiple squads. And I feel like that works really well for pubs, especially if you're trying to get a high kill or high damage game. Of course, for ranked, where RP is a little bit more important, you might want to choose one of the less busy areas, potentially like a mid-tier loot area, or perhaps a high-tier loot area that's away from the dropship path. And again, this also applies to where you're rotating through. If you're trying to get high kill games, perhaps in pubs, then you want to be rotating through the high tier loot areas, because you're more likely to find multiple squads there where you can pick up those kills. Whereas as if you're in ranked and you want to play the game a bit slower to try and build up that RP for placement points, then perhaps you want to be rotating through these lower tier areas. So just something to think about. As you can see, the tier of the loot in an area can be something useful to consider when you decide where to land or rotate through. It can be a strong indicator of how well kitted out an enemy team might be, and also places of where you can expect to find enemy teams. So next time you're trying to decide where to land or rotate through on Olympus in Apex Legends, think about what tier of loot is in that area you're considering, among other things of course. I hope you found this interesting. If you want a copy of the loot map that I've been showing in this video, I have posted it on my Instagram and Twitter, so you can go and view it there if you want to be able to see it while you're playing. Don't forget to like and subscribe, come join our community of friends. For now though, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.